Imagine working your entire life to build something of your own, something you poured your blood, sweat, and tears into, only to have someone else waltz in and claim it like they had every right to it. How would you react? Would you demand justice, call the authorities? Or would you take matters into your own hands and teach them a lesson they'd never forget? For James, a hardworking man who had dedicated years to carving out a peaceful life in his suburban neighborhood, his backyard pool was more than just a luxury. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for. It was his retreat from the stresses of life, a place where he could unwind, listen to the quiet hum of the world, and enjoy the fruits of his labor. Each morning, he would step outside, coffee in hand, and admire the crystal-clear water, feeling a deep sense of pride. It was his own little slice of paradise, a place he had earned. But all of that changed in an instant. One afternoon, James walked out to his backyard expecting the usual peace and quiet, only to be met with a sight that stopped him in his tracks. There, lounging by the edge of his pool like she belonged there, was Karen. Karen, the woman notorious in the neighborhood for her entitled behavior, her passive-aggressive remarks, and, most notably, her barely concealed prejudice. James froze for a moment, trying to process what he was seeing. Karen wasn't just on his property. She was making herself comfortable, stretched out in one of his lounge chairs, sunglasses perched on her face, as if she had every right to be there. Her bare feet dipped lazily into the water, her entire posture exuding arrogance. His first instinct was to assume there had been some kind of mistake. Maybe she was confused. Maybe she had wandered in thinking this was a community pool. Though he knew better. Clearing his throat, he stepped forward. "Karen," he called, his voice steady, though irritation bubbled beneath the surface. She barely flinched, slowly turning her head to glance at him over her sunglasses. "Oh, James," she said lazily, as if she had been expecting him. "Took you long enough. I was starting to wonder if you were even home." James blinked, his jaw tightening. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Karen sighed dramatically, waving a dismissive hand. "Relax, I'm just cooling off. It's been so hot lately, and your pool is just sitting here. It would be a shame to let it go to waste." He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His pool. Going to waste? He had spent years saving up for this, maintaining it, ensuring it remained a pristine haven in his backyard. And yet, here was Karen, sprawled out like it was hers to enjoy, without a shred of guilt or acknowledgement that she was trespassing. Still, James was not the type to let anger get the best of him. "Karen," he said firmly, "this is my property. You can't just walk in here and use my pool whenever you feel like it." Karen finally sat up, pulling her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose to look at him properly. Her eyes were filled with condescension. "Oh, James," she'd scared, shaking her head. "You people are always so territorial. It's just water. It's not like I'm hurting anyone." Those words hit James like a slap. He had encountered Karen's thinly veiled racism before. Little comments here and there, always skating just on the edge of outright discrimination. But this was something else. She wasn't just trespassing. She was belittling him, asserting dominance over something that wasn't hers, making it clear that she didn't see him as an equal. James inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay composed. He had a choice to make. He could call the police, escalate the situation, and let the entire neighborhood watch as this turned into a public spectacle. Or he could handle this himself, in a way that would leave an impression Karen wouldn't soon forget. So what did he do? Stick around to find out. And before we move on, what would you do in this situation? Would you take James's approach or call the cops? Drop your answer in the comments. Option 1, James's way. Or Option 2, calling the police. Let's talk about it. James pulled into his driveway, exhausted from a long day at work. The heat had been unbearable, and all he wanted was to change into something comfortable, step outside, and enjoy a quiet evening by his pool. It was his little escape, a place he could unwind and let the tension of the day melt away. He had been looking forward to it since lunch, counting down the hours until he could finally relax in the serenity of his own backyard. But as soon as he stepped out back, His plans for a peaceful evening came to a screeching halt. There, sprawled out on one of his lounge chairs, was Karen, her sunglasses perched on her nose, a drink in her hand, and her feet lazily dipping into his pool. It was a scene so audacious, so utterly shameless, that for a moment, James wondered if he had stepped into some alternate reality. His first instinct was to blink, to rub his eyes, to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. But no, there she was, as comfortable as if she owned the place. Karen didn't even acknowledge him at first. She simply leaned back, exhaled contentedly, and stretched her legs further into the water, causing ripples to spread across the surface. It was as though she had been there for hours, enjoying his space without a second thought. James took a breath, steadying himself before speaking. "Karen," he called, his voice even but firm. She turned her head slowly, barely pulling her sunglasses down to glance at him. "Oh, James," she said, as though he were the one intruding. "Took you long enough to get home. I was starting to think you weren't coming." His brow furrowed. "What are you doing here?" He tried to keep his tone civil, though his patience was already wearing thin. Karen waved a dismissive hand, taking a slow sip from her glass. "Relax, James. It's just a pool. And it's hot. I figured since it's just sitting here, I might as well make use of it." James felt his jaw clench. "This is my property. You can't just come in here and use my pool without asking." Karen let out a laugh, light and casual, as if his frustration was the most amusing thing she had heard all day. "Oh, come on. Don't be so uptight. It's not like I'm hurting anything." She sighed dramatically, leaning back further into the chair. "You people should be grateful I'm even here." The words hung in the air like a slap. James felt his stomach tighten, a mix of shock and anger twisting inside him. He had dealt with Karen's condescending remarks before, her thinly veiled jabs that always carried an underlying tone of superiority. But this was different. She wasn't just disrespecting him. She was making it clear she didn't see him as an equal. James took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay composed. His fingers curled into his palms, but he didn't let his anger show. "Karen, I need you to leave. Now." She finally sat up, swinging her legs out of the pool and planting her feet on the ground. She looked at him, tilting her head as if considering his words. "You're really making a big deal out of nothing, you know," she said, shaking her head. "Honestly, I don't see why you're so worked up." James stood his ground, refusing to let her brush this off. "This isn't about making a big deal out of nothing. This is my home, my space, and you have no right to be here without my permission." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, James, always so serious. You really need to learn to relax." He stared at her, waiting for her to realize that he wasn't going to back down. But instead of leaving, she smirked and leaned back in the chair again. "I think I'll stay a little longer." James exhaled through his nose, his patience nearly gone. He had spent years working for everything he had, building a home he was proud of, and he wasn't about to let someone like Karen walk in and treat it like it was hers. But at the same time, he knew exactly what she wanted: to push him, to get a reaction, to make him lose his cool. And he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. "Karen," he said, his voice measured but firm, "I'm asking you one last time. Leave." She sighed dramatically, as if he was being unreasonable. "Fine," she huffed, grabbing her things and standing up. She turned back to him, eyes glinting with amusement. "But you really need to lighten up, James. It's just a pool." And with that, she strolled off, leaving wet footprints across his patio as if to remind him she had been there. James stood there for a long moment, watching as she disappeared through the gate, shaking his head in disbelief. He knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. James watched as Karen sauntered toward the edge of the patio, but she didn't leave. Instead, she stopped, turned back to him, and let out a short, amused laugh. "Oh, James, you act like I'm some kind of intruder," she said, shaking her head. "This is just a pool, just some water in the ground. It's not like I'm taking anything from you." James held his breath, keeping his composure, but she wasn't finished. She took a step forward, crossing her arms as her gaze turned sharp. You know, people like you always act like you own everything. Like you're the only ones who deserve nice things, she sneered. But let me tell you something, James. You're lucky to even be in this neighborhood. His fingers curled at his sides, his jaw tightening as the weight of her words pressed into him. He had worked his entire life to build this home, to create a space where he felt comfortable, where he felt safe. And yet, Karen stood there, making it clear she didn't think he belonged. He exhaled slowly. Karen, I'm asking you again. Leave. Now. She let out a dismissive chuckle and sank back into the lounge chair as if she had all the time in the world. Why should I? I have just as much right to be here as you do. In fact, this whole neighborhood used to be different before people like you started moving in. It's funny how things change, isn't it? James felt his pulse quicken. He had always known Karen was problematic. But this was something else. This wasn't just entitlement. This was hate wrapped up in a smug little package, sitting there in his backyard, daring him to react. He took a step closer. I've asked you politely. You've ignored me. You're trespassing, Karen. I could call the police. She scoffed. Oh, please. What are you going to tell them? That a woman was enjoying the sunshine? That I dared to sit near some water? Do you think they'll actually do anything? Or are you hoping they'll just come and drag me away for you? James didn't say anything. He could see exactly what she was doing. She wanted him to get angry, to explode, to lash out so she could play the victim. It was a game she had probably played before, and she knew how to make it work in her favor. But James wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, he took a slow breath, steadied himself, and looked her dead in the eye. You're right about one thing, Karen. This neighborhood has changed, because people like me worked hard to get here, just like everyone else. I don't owe you an explanation for how I got here, and I sure as hell don't need to justify why I deserve to enjoy my own home in peace. Karen rolled her eyes. Oh, don't get so dramatic, James. You always act like a victim. If anything, I'm doing you a favor, making this place feel a little more upscale. That was it. That was the moment James knew. She wasn't going to stop. She wasn't going to apologize. She wasn't going to acknowledge what she was doing was wrong. No, in her mind, she was completely justified. She had no intention of leaving, not unless he forced her to. And he had no intention of letting this go on any longer. Karen smirked as if she had won whatever game she was playing. But James simply turned and walked away. He wasn't going to argue anymore. He wasn't going to waste another breath trying to reason with someone who refused to listen. Instead, he had another plan. A plan that wouldn't involve shouting, or threats, or escalating this into something worse than it already was. A plan that would make Karen wish she had never stepped foot into his backyard. He just had to set it in motion. James took a deep breath and walked inside his house, his mind racing. He had no intention of letting Karen get away with her arrogance, but he wasn't about to stoop to her level by yelling or getting aggressive. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he needed to handle this in a way that would leave an impression, one she wouldn't forget anytime soon. As he paced through his kitchen, an old memory surfaced, bringing a smirk to his face. It was something he and his childhood friends used to prank each other with, itch powder. It was harmless but maddening. The perfect little revenge for someone like Karen, who thought she could invade his space and walk away without consequences. James rummaged through a cabinet and found an old tin he had long forgotten about. He chuckled under his breath as he examined the small container. It had been years since he had even thought about it. But now, it felt like fate. This was exactly the kind of message Karen needed. Moving quickly but carefully, he walked back outside, making sure Karen was still too busy basking in her own entitlement to notice him. She had closed her eyes again, reclining on the lounge chair like she was on vacation, her smug satisfaction radiating from every pore. With practiced ease, James approached the pool's edge and sprinkled the fine powder into the water, watching as it dissolved almost instantly. He made sure to stay casual, not drawing any attention to himself. If she had even the slightest suspicion, she might hesitate to get back in. That wasn't an option. He needed her in that water. Satisfied, he leaned back against the wall of his patio, sipping his drink and waiting. The minutes passed slowly, each one dragging on as he watched her lounge without a care in the world. He had to be patient. The powder wouldn't take effect right away, and if he seemed too eager, she might sense something was off. Then, finally, the moment he had been waiting for arrived. Karen shifted slightly in her chair, then again, rubbing her arm absently. At first, it was subtle, just a small scratch here and there. James remained still, his expression neutral, watching closely. She moved again, this time scratching the side of her neck. Her brows furrowed, but she didn't say anything. A few seconds later, her movements became more frantic. She scratched at her arms, then her legs, shifting in her seat as if trying to shake off whatever was bothering her. Her breathing grew uneven, her expression turning from mild discomfort to clear irritation. James fought the urge to smirk. It was working. Karen sat up, rubbing at her arms aggressively now, looking around as if trying to figure out what was happening. She glanced at James, her eyes narrowing. "What's in this water?" she demanded, her voice sharp. James shrugged, keeping his tone casual. "Same as always. Just water." She glared at him, clearly not convinced. Her hands continued moving, now clawing at her skin in desperation. "Something's wrong," she muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Why am I so itchy?" She stood up abruptly, nearly stumbling as she did. Her entire body was twitching now, her hands roaming over her skin in an attempt to find relief. She looked at James again, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "Did you do something?" James took another slow sip of his drink, shaking his head. "Karen, you're always so sure of yourself," he said smoothly. "Maybe you should sit down and relax." Karen let out an exasperated groan, shaking her head violently. No, something's wrong." Her breathing grew more erratic, her panic evident now. She tried scratching her back but couldn't reach, twisting awkwardly in place. "I swear to God, if you did something." James merely raised an eyebrow, watching as she stumbled toward the pool's edge, looking at the water as if it held the answers she needed. Then, in a desperate move, she jumped back in, submerging herself, believing it would wash away whatever was making her itch. It didn't. As soon as she surfaced, her hands flew to her face, her panic increasing tenfold. "Oh my God! It's worse! It's worse!" she screamed, splashing frantically. She turned to James, her expression now twisted in full-blown hysteria. "What did you do to me?" James leaned against the railing, barely suppressing his amusement. "Karen," he said, his voice calm, "you might be overreacting. Maybe you're allergic to humility." That sent her over the edge. She scrambled out of the pool, dripping wet, her skin now a patchwork of red from all the furious scratching. "This isn't funny," she shrieked, pulling at her hair as if she could shake the discomfort away. I need help. I need a doctor." James exhaled, finally letting a small smirk break through. "Maybe you should go home, Karen," he suggested. "Since, this isn't actually your pool." But Karen wasn't thinking rationally anymore. Her panic had reached full capacity, and in her frenzied state, she did the only thing she could think of. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "Hello." "Yes, I need help," she cried into the receiver, pacing around the patio in distress. "Someone's poisoned me. I was in the pool, and now my skin, it's burning. I don't know what he did, but I need an ambulance right now." James just watched, shaking his head. The moment was playing out exactly as he expected. He didn't move, didn't interrupt, just let the scene unfold, knowing full well what was coming next. Karen turned back toward him, pointing an accusing finger. "You did this. I know you did. When the police get here, you're going to be sorry." James chuckled, finally letting himself enjoy the moment. "Karen," he said, meeting her gaze with unwavering calm, "I think you brought this on yourself." The sound of sirens echoed down the street, growing louder with each passing second. Karen, still frantically scratching at her arms, paced near the edge of the pool, glancing between James and the approaching patrol cars. Her breathing was heavy, erratic, fueled by her own hysteria. James remained where he was, standing calmly, with his arms crossed. He knew this moment would come. He had seen people like Karen spin stories before, twisting reality to fit their own narrative. But this time, he had nothing to fear. He had done nothing wrong, and the truth would reveal itself soon enough. The first officer stepped out of the car, a tall man with a stoic expression, assessing the situation as his partner followed closely behind. Karen immediately rushed toward them, waving her arms wildly. "Officers, thank God you're here," she shrieked. "I've been attacked. He did something to me." She gestured frantically at James, as if his mere presence was a threat. The officers exchanged a glance before one of them held up a hand. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down and explain what happened," he said, his voice firm but composed. Karen took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing herself to look as pitiful as possible. "I was just minding my own business, using the pool. And then he put something in it. Some kind of chemical. I can't stop itching. My skin is burning." She rubbed at her arms dramatically, her face contorted in exaggerated pain. "He did this on purpose. I want him arrested." The officer turned his gaze toward James. "Sir, what's your side of the story?" James met the officer's eyes without hesitation. "Karen has been trespassing on my property for weeks," he stated, his voice even. "She comes into my backyard, uses my pool without permission, and when I ask her to leave, she refuses. Today was no different. I asked her to leave multiple times, and she ignored me." Karen scoffed, throwing up her hands. "That's a lie. I have every right to be here. I live just a few houses down." The officer raised an eyebrow. "Do you live at this address, ma'am?" he asked, gesturing toward James's home. Karen hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled for a response. "Well, no, but I've used a pool before, and he's never had a problem with it. He just suddenly turned on me." She pointed an accusing finger at James. "He poisoned me. You have to arrest him." The officers looked at each other, noting the clear inconsistencies in her story. One of them glanced around the backyard, taking in the scene. James was calm, collected, standing near his patio furniture, while Karen was flustered, frantic, and unable to keep her accusations straight. "Ma'am, do you have any proof that he did anything to the pool?" the officer asked. Karen's face flushed red. Look at me. I'm covered in hives. Doesn't that prove anything?" She scratched furiously at her skin, still convinced she could make them believe her story through sheer desperation. One of the officers pulled out a notepad. "You said he put something in the pool, correct? What exactly did you see him do?" Karen faltered. I didn't see him do it. But I know he did. Who else would have done it?" James let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "I haven't touched that pool except to maintain it. If she's having a reaction, maybe she should see a doctor instead of accusing me of something I didn't do." Karen gritted her teeth, fists clenching at her sides. "Oh, so now you're calling me crazy?" she snapped. "I should have known. You people always think you're so smart, so above the law." The words barely left her mouth before James felt the sting of her palm against his face. The slap came out of nowhere, fast and fueled by rage, and for a brief second, the entire yard fell into stunned silence. The officers were on her instantly. "Ma'am, that's enough," one of them barked, grabbing her arm and pulling her back. "That's assault. You're under arrest." Karen's eyes went wide with shock. "What? No. You can't do this. I'm the victim. He tricked me. This isn't fair." "You have the right to remain silent," the officer continued, ignoring her protests as he pulled out a pair of handcuffs and secured them around her wrists. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." James exhaled slowly, touching his cheek where the slap had landed, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Karen had done all the talking, and now she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. By now, several neighbors had gathered along the sidewalk, watching the scene unfold. James could see their expressions shifting, some with mild shock, others with understanding. The truth had been laid out before them, and now, Karen's carefully crafted facade was crumbling in real time. As the officers led her toward the patrol car, she continued shouting, "You're making a mistake. He did this. I swear. You'll regret this." But no one was listening anymore. The officer who had taken James's statement turned back to him. "Sir, are you okay? Do you want to press charges?" James considered it for a moment before shaking his head. "I think this is enough. She needs to learn a lesson, but I don't need to drag it out any further." The officer nodded. "We'll still file a report, but it's your call if you want to take it further." James gave a small, tired smile. "I just want my piece back." As Karen was placed into the back of the patrol car, the realization finally seemed to hit her. Her shouting turned into quiet muttering, and she slumped against the seat, defeated. James turned toward his house, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. The night air felt cooler now, calmer, as if the universe itself had shifted in his favor. The neighbors began to disperse, whispering amongst themselves. James didn't need to hear what they were saying. He already knew. Karen had finally been exposed for who she really was, and for the first time in weeks, James felt like he could breathe again. James stood on his patio, watching as the last remnants of the chaotic night faded away. The flashing lights of the patrol car disappeared into the distance, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt almost surreal. He exhaled, allowing the tension in his shoulders to finally dissipate. For weeks, he had been dealing with Karen's entitled behavior, her relentless trespassing, and her blatant disrespect. But now, at last, he had his peace. It wasn't anger that resolved the situation. It wasn't a heated argument, shouting match, or physical confrontation. It was patience, strategy, and an unwavering commitment to not letting her manipulate the narrative. James had refused to meet her aggression with more aggression. Instead, he had let her own actions expose who she truly was. Injustice has a way of demanding an immediate reaction. It fuels the fire inside, makes the pulse race, and tempts even the most level-headed individuals to fight fire with fire. But James had chosen another route, one that required control, foresight, and restraint. He had proven that sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is not to become one yourself. The neighborhood had been watching, whether from behind curtains or out on their porches. They had seen how Karen operated. They had heard her words, seen her behavior, and now understood the truth that had been there all along. No longer could she disguise herself as the innocent victim. No longer could she use manipulation and entitlement to get her way. The mask had been removed, and her own actions had written her downfall. James's reputation in the neighborhood shifted overnight. Once just another homeowner, he was now someone people respected, not because he had fought back with force, but because he had fought back with intelligence. There was something admirable about a person who could stand firm without losing their dignity. He hadn't let Karen take away his peace, nor had he let her go unchallenged. He had simply let justice unfold in its own time. And now, for the first time in a long time, James could finally enjoy his pool the way he had always intended. No more intrusions. No more entitlement. No more looking over his shoulder, wondering when she would barge in next. He stepped to the water's edge, dipping his fingers into the cool, clear pool, feeling the quiet victory settle over him. It was a small but meaningful reminder that respect is something earned, not demanded. Life has a funny way of delivering karma. Some lessons come in the form of words, others in actions. And in Karen's case, sometimes karma comes in the form of an itch. What about you? If you had been in James's situation, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have taken the patient, strategic approach? Or would you have called the cops from the start? Let's talk about it in the comments. Option 1, James's way. Or Option 2, calling the police. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life stories just like this one. Until next time, remember, patience and intelligence often win where anger and impulsiveness fail.